The judge's laughter echoed in the cavernous courtroom, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the tense silence. It was aimed at David, a 9-year-old boy in a clip-on tie, standing on trembling legs. "Objection?" Judge Thompson repeated, his face a mask of disbelief and amusement. "Son, this isn't a school play." Beside him, Caroline Covington, the woman trying to ruin his mother's life, smirked, her victory seemingly assured. David's mother, Sarah, squeezed his hand, her knuckles white with fear, trying to pull him back down. But David didn't move. He just stared back at the judge, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. They all thought he was a joke. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The scent of lavender and old money clung to the air in Celeste, a boutique in Charlotte's rapidly gentrifying South End. 9-year-old David Miller traced the patterns in the polished marble floor with the toe of his sneaker, trying to make himself as small as possible. He and his mom, Sarah, were only here because Mrs. Henderson, one of her elderly patients, had given her a gift card for her birthday. "You work too hard, Sarah," she'd said, pressing the crisp envelope into her hand. "Go buy yourself something frivolous." Frivolous wasn't in Sarah's vocabulary. Practical, durable, on sale, those were her words. But she'd promised Mrs. Henderson. So here they were, navigating racks of silk blouses with price tags that looked more like down payments. Sarah touched a soft, cream-colored scarf, a small, wistful smile on her face. For a moment, she wasn't a weary nurse who worked double shifts, but just a woman admiring something beautiful. That moment was shattered by a sharp, condescending voice. "Can I help you?" The woman who approached them was tall and severe, dressed in a tailored white suit that seemed to radiate disapproval. A nameplate on her lapel read, "Caroline." Her eyes flicked from Sarah's simple dress to David's jeans and hoodie, and her lips thinned into a perfectly straight line. "We're just looking, thank you," Sarah said, her smile faltering slightly as she let the scarf slip from her fingers. "This is a high-end establishment," Caroline said, her voice low and carrying. "The pieces are very delicate. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a department store in the mall." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal. Heat prickled on David's neck. He saw his mother's shoulders slump, the light in her eyes dimming. She was retreating into herself, the way she did when she was hurt or exhausted. He hated it. "My mom has a gift card," David said, his voice small but clear. He hated the way it trembled. Caroline's gaze shifted to him, cold and dismissive. "Oh, really?" she drawled, as if the idea were preposterous. Sarah put a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "David, it's okay. We were just about to leave anyway." She was trying to de-escalate, to escape the suffocating judgment of the store, but Caroline wasn't done. She took a step closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for several other patrons to hear. "We've had some issues with people using fraudulent gift cards lately. I'll need to verify it before you handle any more of the merchandise." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A woman in pearls nearby clutched her purse a little tighter. A young man scrolling on his phone looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. He subtly angled his phone, the red dot of a recording light blinking almost imperceptibly. Sarah's face flushed with a deep, painful red. "That's not necessary," she said, her voice tight. "We're leaving." She turned, pulling David with her, but he resisted. He wasn't just a 9-year-old boy. He was the son of James Miller, a paralegal who had spent his life fighting for the underdog. His father had died 2 years ago, but he'd left David his books, his sense of justice, and a burning hatred for bullies. And this woman was a bully. "You can't just accuse someone of fraud," David said, pulling the well-worn copy of the North Carolina General Statutes from his backpack. It was his favorite book. Under Statute 14100, that's slander per se. You're accusing her of a crime in front of other people, which could damage her reputation." Caroline stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. The absurdity of a child quoting legal statutes seemed to short-circuit her brain. Then, a slow, derisive smile spread across her face. "How cute," she cooed, her voice dripping with venom. "Did you learn that from a television show?" The woman in pearls giggled. The man with the phone was now recording openly, a smirk on his face. Humiliation washed over David, hot and suffocating. He had tried to use his father's weapon. Logic, the law, and it had been turned into a joke. "Let's go, David," Sarah insisted, her voice breaking. She pulled him firmly towards the door, her only goal to escape the prison of prying eyes. As they burst out onto the sunny sidewalk, Carolyn's voice followed them, sharp and triumphant. "And don't come back! We have the right to refuse service to anyone!" Sarah didn't stop walking until they were a block away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She leaned against a brick wall, covering her face with her hands. David could see her shoulders shaking. He had tried to defend her, to be the man of the house his father would have wanted him to be. Instead, he had only made it worse. The shame felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his small chest. He looked back towards the boutique and saw the man with the phone walk out, still smiling at his screen. The spark had been lit, and the world was about to watch it burn. The video was titled, "Little Lawyer Gets Schooled by Boutique Karen." It was everywhere. By the time David and Sarah got home to their modest two-bedroom apartment, the clip was already rocketing through the digital universe. The man from the store had edited it cleverly, starting with David's trembling, high-pitched voice, quoting the slander statute, followed immediately by Caroline Covington's patronizing dismissal and the titters of the other customers. The clip ended with a freeze frame on David's mortified face as his mother pulled him away. It was a perfectly crafted piece of viral humiliation. Comments flooded in by the thousands. "Kid watches too much Law & Order LOL," one said. "That lady is a boss, shutting him down like that," said another. A whole new persona was created for David. Lawyer Kid, a meme representing childish arrogance getting a reality check. His earnest attempt to defend his mother's honor was twisted into a joke for the world to laugh at. For Sarah, the consequences were more immediate and devastating. The video didn't show the beginning of the confrontation, Carolyn's profiling, her initial accusation. It only showed a black woman and her son being kicked out of a store after the boy made a scene. By morning, the hospital where Sarah worked as a pediatric nurse had called. "Sarah, it's Linda from HR." The voice on the phone was strained. "We've been getting calls about this video. The hospital's name has been mentioned in some online forums. It's creating a public relations issue." "But I didn't do anything wrong," Sarah pleaded, her voice desperate. "We were insulted. We were accused of being criminals." "I understand," Linda said, though her tone made it clear she didn't. "But the optics are not good. The board has decided to place you on unpaid administrative leave pending a full investigation." The phone felt slick in Sarah's hand. Unpaid leave. Their savings were barely a cushion, more like a thin sheet. Rent was due in 2 weeks. David needed new shoes. The weight of it all was crushing. Meanwhile, Caroline Covington was not content with her viral victory. She was, as David would later discover, the CEO of Covington Properties, the very real estate firm responsible for most of the gentrification in South End. Her public image was meticulously curated. A video showing her being defied, even by a child, was a crack in that facade. She needed to control the narrative completely. Her high-priced legal team, from the firm of Abernathy, Steele and Finch, drafted a lawsuit. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, SLAP-P. Suit designed to intimidate and silence. They sued Sarah Miller for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The suit claimed Sarah and her son had entered the store with the intent to cause a disturbance, that David's aggressive quoting of legal code was a form of harassment, and that Caroline now suffered from anxiety and feared for her safety. The legal documents arrived via a process server a week later, a thick, intimidating manila envelope that felt like a bomb. Sarah read through the pages, the dense legal jargon swimming before her eyes. They were demanding $250,000 in damages. The room tilted. Sarah sank onto their worn-out sofa, the papers scattering on the floor. The fight had gone out of her. She was a nurse, a healer. She didn't know how to fight monsters like Caroline Covington, who could afford lawyers that twisted reality into a weapon. David found her there, staring blankly at the wall, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. He picked up one of the pages. Complaint and summons. He knew what those words meant. He had read about them in his father's copy of Civil Procedure in a Nutshell. "She's suing us?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, a sob finally breaking free. She's saying we attacked her, that we planned it, that I'm a bad person, a bad mother." David looked at his mother, so strong and capable in her nurse's scrubs, now broken and defeated on their couch. The shame he'd felt in the store curdled into a cold, hard rage. This was wrong. The law wasn't supposed to be a tool for the rich to crush the poor. It was supposed to be a shield for the innocent. His father had believed that. He had taught David to believe it too. He knelt and gathered the scattered pages. His hands were small, but they were steady. While the internet laughed at Thuttermasher lawyer kid, and while Caroline Covington marshaled her army of attorneys, David retreated to his room. He closed the door and pulled the heavy, leather-bound law books from his shelf. He took out the legal pads and pens he'd bought with 3 weeks' worth of allowance. He wasn't a joke. He was James Miller's son, and he would not let his mother be broken. He opened the first book, the crisp scent of old paper filling the small room. The escalating war had been declared by Caroline Covington, but David Miller was the one who was about to arm himself for battle. The summons stipulated that Sarah had 30 days to respond to the complaint. 30 days felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Their world shrank to the 4 walls of their apartment, the ticking of the clock a constant, mocking reminder of their dwindling options. Sarah spent the first week in a fog of panic, making frantic calls to legal aid societies, only to be told they were overwhelmed with cases, or that her situation didn't meet their specific criteria. She called private attorneys, who quoted retainer fees that were more than she made in 6 months. One lawyer, a tired-sounding man named Mr. Davies, offered her a free 20-minute consultation over the phone. He listened with a series of weary sighs. "It's a slap suit, Ms. Miller," he said bluntly. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's not designed to win. It's designed to bleed you dry. Covington's lawyers will file motion after motion, request endless depositions. It will cost you tens of thousands of dollars you don't have, just to defend yourself. Most people just give up. They issue an apology, sign an NDA, and it goes away. But I have nothing to apologize for," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "She's the one who lied. The truth is expensive, Ms. Miller," Mr. Davies said, not unkindly. "Sometimes more expensive than a lie. My advice? Try to settle. See if they'll drop it for a written apology." Sarah hung up, the advice feeling like a punch to the gut. Apologize for being racially profiled? Apologize for being humiliated? It felt like a betrayal of her own dignity. While Sarah wrestled with an impossible choice, David worked. His bedroom became a war room. He covered the walls with pages from his legal pads, creating flowcharts and mind maps. He used different colored pens to link case precedents to specific claims in Covington's lawsuit. He stayed up late, long after his mother thought he was asleep. a small desk lamp illuminating the dense text of books that most adults, let alone children, would find impenetrable. He wasn't just reading, he was dissecting. He read about the discovery process, the rules of evidence, and the importance of courtroom decorum. He learned the difference between a motion to dismiss and a motion for summary judgment. He found a little-known North Carolina statute about pro se litigants, people who represent themselves in court, and the assistance they were permitted to receive. One evening, he approached his mother as she sat at the kitchen table, pushing a pile of bills around. "Mom," he began, his voice serious, "we shouldn't settle." Sarah looked up, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. "David, honey, we don't have a choice. We don't have a lawyer. We don't have any money. We have the truth," David said simply, "and we have the law. Her whole case is based on lies. We can prove it." He pushed a neatly written page across the table. It was a draft of an answer to complaint, a formal response to the lawsuit. In it, he had gone through Carolyn Covington's claims one by one, and next to each, he had written a simple, powerful word. Denied. Sarah stared at it. His handwriting was still a child's, the letters rounded and a little wobbly. But the legal language was precise. He had even cited the correct rule of civil procedure for filing an answer. "Where did you learn to do this?" she whispered, a sense of awe cutting through her despair. "Dad's books," he said. "I read them after he was gone. It felt like he was still here, teaching me." He paused, his gaze steady. "Dad never backed down from a bully. We can't either." A flicker of the old fire returned to Sarah's eyes. Looking at her son, so small yet so fierce, she felt a surge of shame for her own readiness to surrender. James would have been so proud. She made a decision. She would not apologize for something she didn't do. She would not let Caroline Covington bully her into submission. Together, they finalized the answer. The next day, Sarah put on her best dress, the one she saved for church and parent-teacher conferences, and they took the bus downtown to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The building was a granite fortress, designed to intimidate. People in sharp suits rushed past them, speaking in a clipped, important language of their own. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of floor polish and anxiety. Sarah's hands trembled as she handed the document to the clerk, a stern-faced woman behind a wall of plexiglass. The clerk stamped the papers with a resounding thud that echoed Sarah's racing heart. It was done. They had officially answered. They were in the fight. As they walked out of the courthouse and into the harsh sunlight, Sarah felt a terrifying mix of dread and empowerment. She had no lawyer, no money, and her opponent was one of the most powerful women in the city. But she wasn't alone. She looked down at her son, who was staring up at the courthouse, not with fear, but with a look of intense concentration, as if he were sizing up an opponent on a chessboard. He had armed himself with his father's knowledge, and now he was leading them both into battle. The Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson believed in order. He believed in precedent, procedure, and the solemnity of his courtroom. At 62, with a mane of silver hair and a face etched with the gravity of 2 decades on the bench, he had seen every kind of legal drama imaginable, or so he thought. Courtroom 4B was his domain. The dark wood paneling, the state seal hanging above his head, the hushed reverence of the gallery. It was all designed to reinforce the power of the law. On this particular Tuesday morning, his docket was filled with the usual civil motions. He dispatched them with practiced efficiency, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that tolerated no nonsense. Then he called case number 25 CVD 118, Covington v. Miller. Carolyn Covington swept in, flanked by 2 lawyers from Abernathy, Steele, and Finch. They were the legal equivalent of a SEAL team, expensive, precise, and utterly ruthless. They took their places at the plaintiff's table, arranging stacks of files and laptops with an air of effortless superiority. On the other side of the aisle, Sarah Miller sat alone. She wore the same simple dress she'd worn to file her answer, and she clutched a single thin folder in her lap. She looked like a sparrow facing down a flock of eagles. In the first row of the gallery, directly behind her, sat her son, David. He had insisted on wearing a clip-on tie, which was slightly askew. On his lap was a thick, dog-eared law book. Judge Thompson peered down from the bench, his eyes narrowed behind his reading glasses. He noted Sarah's lack of legal counsel. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "You are representing yourself, pro se?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "A bold choice, given the caliber of the opposing counsel," the judge noted dryly. One of Covington's lawyers, a man with a jaw so tight it looked like it could crack walnuts, allowed himself a small, smug smile. "Let's proceed," the judge sighed. "Mr. Abernathy, you may begin." Arthur Abernathy, a senior partner with a voice as smooth and cold as river stones, rose to his feet. He began to paint a picture of his client, Carolyn Covington, as a pillar of the community, a benevolent businesswoman who had been viciously targeted and harassed. "My client was merely doing her job, ensuring the security of her establishment," Abernathy intoned, "when she was accosted by the defendant and her accomplice." He gestured vaguely toward David. David stiffened. "Accomplice? He was 9. Abernathy played the viral video on a large screen for the court. The curated, humiliating clip filled the room. Laughter from the patrons in the video echoed softly. Judge Thompson watched, his expression unreadable but tinged with a familiar weariness. He'd seen social media squabbles spill into his courtroom before. It always struck him as a waste of time. "As you can see, Your Honor," Abernathy continued, "the defendant's son became aggressive, belligerent even. My client, Ms. Covington, a single woman, felt threatened. She feared the situation would escalate. She has suffered from severe anxiety since this calculated attack on her reputation." Sarah wanted to stand up and scream. Belligerent? Calculated? David had been trying to protect her, but she knew she had to wait her turn. She felt helpless, a pawn in a game where she didn't even know the rules. In the gallery, David was not watching the screen. He was watching the judge. He saw the flicker of annoyance, the subtle tightening of his jaw. Judge Thompson was bored. He'd already made up his mind. To him, this was another frivolous case clogging up his docket. A rich woman with too much time on her hands and a poor woman in over her head. He just wanted it to be over. When Abernathy finished, Judge Thompson turned to Sarah. "Ms. Miller, do you have a response?" Sarah stood, her legs shaking. "Your Honor, that's not what happened. She accused us. She profiled us the moment we walked in. The video doesn't show that." "Do you have evidence of this, Ms. Miller? A recording of your own?" the judge asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "No, Your Honor, just my word." Judge Thompson let out a small, almost inaudible sigh. "I see." He looked down at the paperwork, then peered over his glasses at the small boy in the gallery. "And what about you, young man?" he said, a hint of condescending amusement in his voice. "You're the famous Charker lawyer kid, I take it. Are you here to provide legal counsel?" The lawyers at the plaintiff's table snickered. Carolyn Covington smiled, a thin, cruel slash of red lipstick. David felt the blood rush to his face. The judge wasn't just dismissing his mother. He was mocking him. He was making him the punchline all over again, right here in the one place that was supposed to be about fairness. "I'm here to support my mother, Your Honor," David said, his voice tight. "I'm sure you are," the judge said, turning his attention back to the lawyers. "Let's move on to the motion for summary judgment." He waved a dismissive hand, and in that small gesture, David saw their entire case being swept away. The judge wasn't listening. He wasn't seeing the truth. He was just following the procedure, and the procedure was leading them straight to a cliff. David knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he didn't do something, his mother would lose everything. The order of the court was about to be broken. Arthur Abernathy was in his element. He strode confidently before the bench, his voice resonating with practiced authority as he argued his motion for summary judgment. He contended that there were no material facts in dispute. The video spoke for itself, he argued, and therefore the judge should rule in his client's favor immediately, without the need for a full trial. The defendant's own actions, and those of her son, clearly constitute harassment, Abernathy declared, his tone final. She has presented no evidence to the contrary, only unsubstantiated claims. To prolong this matter would be a waste of the court's valuable time and a continued torment for my client. Judge Thompson seemed to agree. He was nodding along, looking eager to clear his docket. He glanced at Sarah. Ms. Miller, do you have a legal argument as to why I should not grant this motion? And I mean a legal argument, not an emotional one. Sarah's mind went blank. Legal argument? She didn't know the standards for summary judgment. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The eagles were circling, and she was frozen. She could only stammer. But it's not true. Abernathy scoffed softly. Your Honor, the defendant is clearly out of her depth. It was in that moment of crushing silence, with his mother's defeat hanging heavy in the air, that David Miller made his move. He saw the entire chessboard. The smug plaintiff, the dismissive judge, the overwhelmed defendant, and the inexorable march toward a checkmate built on lies. His father had once told him, "The law is a conversation. You just have to know when it's your turn to speak." He stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, a raw, jarring sound in the quiet courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor." The words, spoken in a clear, unbroken treble, sliced through the room. Every head turned. Arthur Abernathy stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Sarah gasped, spinning around to look at her son with wide, terrified eyes. Judge Marcus Thompson slowly removed his glasses. He leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, and stared down at the small boy in the slightly too large blazer and crooked tie. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then the judge's lips began to twitch. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, growing into a full, incredulous laugh. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, sharp and ugly. It was the sound of adult authority mocking childish audacity. "Objection?" Judge Thompson repeated, his eyes crinkling with amusement as he looked around the courtroom, sharing the joke. "Son, this isn't a school play. You're in the gallery. You have no standing here. Sit down before I have the bailiff remove you." The Covington legal team joined in, their laughter more subdued, but just as cruel. Carolyn Covington covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her shoulders shaking with mirth. "David, please!" Sarah whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Sit down. You're making it worse." But David didn't sit. He didn't flinch. The laughter washed over him, but it didn't touch the core of cold, focused anger inside him. He had been laughed at before. This time, he was ready. He took a step forward, into the aisle. "My apologies for the improper venue of my objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "But Mr. Abernathy's statement is foundationally incorrect. He claims there are no material facts in dispute. That is false. The central fact of this case, the motivation and context of the interaction, is entirely in dispute." The judge's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a look of sheer astonishment. The boy wasn't just posturing, he was making a coherent legal point. "Who are you?" the judge demanded, his voice now laced with irritation. "You are not a party to this case. You are not an officer of the court. You will be silent." "I am David Miller," he replied, taking a small breath. "And while I am not a member of the bar, under North Carolina General Statute 111, a pro se litigant is entitled to assistance. The statute does not specify that this assistant must be an adult or a licensed attorney, only that they can help the litigant present their case. My mother, the defendant, wishes for me to assist her." He turned to Sarah. "Mom?" Sarah, seeing the impossible courage in her son's eyes, found her own. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, protective pride. She straightened her shoulders and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong for the first time that day. "I do. I wish for my son, David Miller, to assist me in my defense." The courtroom was utterly silent. Abernathy looked as if he'd been slapped. He sputtered, "Your Honor, this is preposterous. He's a child. He's the one who instigated the entire event. It's a complete conflict of interest." Judge Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. He was no longer amused. He was staring at David with a new, calculating expression. "Statute 111? He asked, a challenge in his voice. "Are you certain about that, son?" "Yes, Your Honor," David said. "And I would also direct the court's attention to the 1982 state appellate case, Godwin v. West, which affirmed that procedural rules should be interpreted liberally for pro se litigants to ensure that justice is accessible, not obstructed by technicalities. The spirit of the law is to ensure a fair hearing, and my mother cannot get a fair hearing if the full context of the plaintiff's provocation is ignored." Judge Thompson stared, speechless. It wasn't just that the boy knew the statute. He knew the case law interpreting it. He had just cited a 30-year-old appellate decision from memory. A hush fell over the room as the bailiff, at a quiet signal from the judge, handed him a law book. The judge flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the text. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Finally, he looked up. His face was a mask of disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, so softly that only the court reporter heard him. He looked from the book to the boy. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. In its place was something that David had not expected to see in the judge's eyes, a flicker of grudging respect. The joke was over. Abernathy was on his feet again, his face flushed a blotchy red. "Your Honor, I must object in the strongest possible terms. This is a circus. The child is a witness, a participant. He cannot act as a legal assistant. This entire charade is an attempt to manipulate the court and generate sympathy." Judge Thompson held up a silencing hand, his gaze still fixed on David. The gears were turning in the judge's mind. The boy was right about the statute and the case law. While highly unorthodox, it wasn't explicitly forbidden. Denying the request could be grounds for an appeal based on the very precedent the boy had just cited. It was a perfectly sprung legal trap. "The boy makes a valid point, Mr. Abernathy," the judge said slowly, the words seeming to taste strange in his mouth. "The statute is ambiguous as to the qualifications of an assistant. While this is highly irregular, I will allow it, on a very short leash." He turned his stern gaze to David. "You will sit at the defendant's table. You will address the court only when permitted. You will conduct yourself with the decorum this room demands. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Thank you, Your Honor," David said, his voice unwavering. He walked past the gallery rail, his small footsteps echoing in the silent room, and sat down next to his mother. Sarah took his hand under the table, her own hand still trembling, but now with adrenaline instead of fear. The power dynamic in the room had fractured. Caroline Covington was no longer smirking. She was whispering furiously to her other lawyer. Abernathy looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. For the first time, a seed of doubt had been planted in their fortress of certainty. "Now," Judge Thompson said, resettling himself on the bench. "We were discussing the motion for summary judgment. Mr. Miller, Jr., he added, with a slight ironic twist of his lips. "You claimed there are material facts in dispute. Please enlighten me." This was the moment. David took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. He had rehearsed this in his room 100 times. "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff's entire motion rests on a single piece of evidence, a misleadingly edited video. The material facts that are in dispute all occurred before that recording began. He stood and faced the bench, just as he'd seen lawyers do in his father's books. First, there is the fact of discriminatory intent. Ms. Covington approached my mother not to offer assistance, but to dismiss her based on her appearance. We will prove this by calling other patrons from the store as witnesses, patrons who were not asked to leave and were not accused of carrying fraudulent gift cards. Abernathy shot to his feet. "Objection! He has no witnesses! We have their faces from the unedited video footage, which we will subpoena from the man who filmed it," David retorted calmly, without missing a beat. "We have his social media handle from the Post. His name is Todd Mackey. We can find him." The judge raised an eyebrow. Subpoena. Social media handles. The boy's vocabulary was as startling as his logic. "Continue," the judge said. "Second," David went on, his confidence growing, "there is the fact of slander per se. Ms. Covington accused my mother of intending to commit a crime in front of multiple people. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a factual claim that the plaintiff made and that we dispute. The edited video conveniently omits her exact words, but we will prove she said them through witness testimony. Third, and most importantly, the plaintiff claims she suffered emotional distress. We contend that she, in fact, inflicted it. My mother is a pediatric nurse. Her reputation for honesty and integrity is essential to her career. After the video went viral, she was placed on unpaid leave." Sarah squeezed his hand, a silent confirmation. "Therefore," David concluded, his voice ringing with a conviction that belied his age, "this case is not about a belligerent child, as the plaintiff claims. It is about a pattern of discriminatory behavior, a false accusation, and a malicious attempt to use a lawsuit to silence and punish the victims. These are all material facts that must be decided by a jury, not dismissed in a summary judgment." He sat down. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. He had laid out a clear, concise, and devastatingly effective counterargument. He hadn't used emotion. He had used the law exactly as the judge had demanded. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at Arthur Abernathy, who seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. He looked at Caroline Covington, whose mask of cool superiority had cracked, revealing a flicker of raw panic. And he looked at the 9-year-old boy who had just dismantled a senior partner's entire motion with the precision of a surgeon. "Mr. Abernathy," the judge said, his voice low and dangerous, "your motion for summary judgment is denied. It appears there is a great deal more to this case than a simple video. Prepare for discovery. We are going to trial." The judge banged his gavel, the sound sealing David's victory. It was a thunderclap that signaled not the end of a storm, but the beginning of one. The news of a 9-year-old boy being granted permission to act as a legal assistant, and then promptly defeating a motion from a top-tier law firm, ripped through the courthouse corridors. By the time David and Sarah walked out, a local news reporter was already waiting on the steps. The story of Tonsure Lawyer Kid was about to get a dramatic rewrite. The trial began 2 months later. In that time, the world had caught up to the story unfolding in courtroom 4B. The narrative had flipped. David was no longer a meme. He was a prodigy, a folk hero. News outlets dubbed him the boy who objected. A crowdfunding page set up by a sympathetic neighbor to cover Sarah's living expenses while she was on leave raised over $50,000 in a week. The hospital, facing a public relations nightmare of its own, quietly reinstated her with back pay. The pressure was now on Caroline Covington. Her company's board was nervous. Sponsors of a charity gala she was chairing pulled out. The hunter had become the hunted. This new reality was palpable on the first day of the trial. The gallery was packed with reporters and curious members of the public. Judge Thompson presided with a renewed, intense focus. He had made it clear there would be no more shenanigans. This would be a trial by the book. David, sitting beside his mother, was calm and prepared. The discovery process, which he had navigated with Sarah, had been a revelation. They had successfully subpoenaed the unedited footage from Todd Mackey, the man who filmed the incident. They had also, at David's insistence, filed a request for any and all complaints of discrimination filed against any of Covington's retail or real estate properties in the last 5 years. Her lawyers had fought it furiously, but Judge Thompson, now deeply skeptical of the plaintiff, had allowed it. The results were a stack of documents 3 inches thick. The turning point came on the 3rd day, when Caroline Covington took the stand. Arthur Abernathy led her through her well-rehearsed testimony. She portrayed herself as a calm professional, faced with an increasingly erratic and hostile situation. She used words like unsettled, alarmed, and frightened. Then, it was Sarah's turn to cross-examine. She stood, and the room held its breath. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady, "I would like my assistant, David Miller, to conduct the cross-examination." Abernathy leaped up. "Objection! This is outrageous!" "Mr. Abernathy, he is a court-approved assistant," Judge Thompson said flatly. "I will allow it. But Mr. Miller," he warned, looking at David, "you will be professional." "Yes, Your Honor," David said. He walked to the lectern, which was so tall he could barely see over it. The bailiff quietly brought him a small step stool. The sight was surreal. A small boy on a stool, about to cross-examine one of the city's most powerful CEOs. David began, his voice calm and polite. "Ms. Covington, you testified that you felt frightened by my mother and me. Is that correct?" "Yes, it is," Caroline said, forcing a pained expression. "I was very intimidated." "Intimidated by a 9-year-old boy and his mother, who is a nurse?" "The situation was very tense," she insisted. "Let's talk about that tension," David said. "Before the recording began, did you or did you not say to my mother, 'Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a department store in the mall'?" Caroline shifted in her seat. "I may have suggested another option, yes. And why did you suggest that?" "I was concerned the merchandise was out of her price range. I didn't want to see her embarrassed." "How did you determine her price range, Ms. Covington? Did you ask her, or did you just look at her clothes and the color of her skin?" "Objection!" Abernathy shouted. "Counsel is badgering the witness and making baseless accusations." "Sustained," the judge said. "Rephrase, Mr. Miller." David nodded. "Ms. Covington, is it standard practice to suggest shoppers leave your store based on your assessment of their finances?" No. "Then why did you do it to my mother?" Caroline was silent, her jaw tight. David continued. "Let's move on to the gift card. You testified you were concerned it was fraudulent. In the past year, how many fraudulent gift cards have been presented at your store?" I don't know the exact number." "We do," David said, picking up a document. "We subpoenaed your store's loss prevention reports. The number is 0. There have been no reported cases of gift card fraud at your store in over 5 years. So why did you accuse my mother?" The trap was sprung. Caroline's eyes darted toward her lawyer, but he could offer no help. "It was just a feeling I had," she stammered. "A feeling," David repeated softly. He then projected the unedited video from Todd Mackey's phone onto the large screen. It clearly showed Caroline approaching them, her disdainful expression, and her sharp, dismissive words. Then it showed her accusing Sarah of fraud. The jury was captivated. "Now, Ms. Covington," David said, his voice rising with controlled power, "let's talk about your feelings. Is it the same feeling you had when you tried to evict the tenants of the Oakwood Apartments, a predominantly black community, to build luxury condos?" Abernathy was on his feet again, shouting, "Objection! Relevance!" "Your Honor," David countered smoothly, "it is highly relevant. It speaks to a pattern of behavior and intent. The plaintiff's entire case rests on her claim of emotional distress. We are proving that she is, in fact, the one who consistently uses her power to inflict distress on others, particularly minorities." "Overruled," Judge Thompson boomed. "Answer the question, Ms. Covington." Caroline looked pale. That was a business decision. David produced the thick stack of complaints. And was it a business decision when you were formally accused of housing discrimination by 5 different families? Or when 3 former employees filed lawsuits alleging racial bias in your hiring practices? Are all of these people lying, Ms. Covington? Or do you just have a feeling about a certain type of person? He let the question hang in the air. He didn't need an answer. He had painted the picture for the jury, using Caroline Covington's own history as the canvas and her own words as the paint. He had shown them that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a single chapter in a long, ugly book of prejudice and power abuse. He looked at the jury, then at Caroline Covington, who now seemed small and exposed in the witness box. "No further questions, Your Honor," David said, and stepped down from the stool. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was a foregone conclusion to everyone in the courtroom except, perhaps, Caroline Covington, who sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her face a pale, strained mask. When the jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, stood to read the verdict, she didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at Sarah and David. "On the complaint of defamation against the defendant, Sarah Miller, we the jury find for the defendant." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. "On the complaint of harassment, we find for the defendant." "On the complaint of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find for the defendant." With each pronouncement, it was as if a physical weight was being lifted from Sarah's shoulders. She began to cry, but this time, her tears were not of fear or despair, but of profound, overwhelming relief. David simply slipped his small hand into hers and squeezed. But Judge Thompson was not finished. "Ms. Covington, Mr. Abernathy, please approach the bench," he commanded, his voice like rolling thunder. They rose, their movements stiff, and walked towards the judge. He leaned forward, his voice lowered but still carrying an unmistakable edge of fury. "Mr. Abernathy," he began, "in my 20 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such a flagrant, malicious abuse of the judicial process. You brought a meritless slap suit into my courtroom. You coached your client to lie under oath, and you attempted to bully a decent woman into submission. It was a disgusting display." He then turned his glacial gaze upon Carolyn. "Ms. Covington, you have perjured yourself repeatedly. You have wasted this court's time and the taxpayers' money. You came here seeking to ruin a woman's reputation, and in the end, you have only incinerated your own." He straightened up, his voice now booming through the courtroom. "This court finds that the plaintiff, Caroline Covington, and her counsel filed this lawsuit in bad faith. Therefore, pursuant to Rule 11 of the Rules of Civil Procedure, I am ordering the plaintiff to pay for all of the defendant's legal fees and associated costs." He paused. "Furthermore, based on the testimony I have heard in my courtroom, I am taking the extraordinary step of referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into potential charges of perjury and filing a false police report, which your initial complaint effectively constitutes." Abernathy's jaw dropped. Carolyn swayed on her feet, looking as if she might faint. The consequences were no longer just social, they were criminal. The judge banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Caroline Covington. The DA's office launched a full-scale investigation not just into the trial, but into the numerous discrimination complaints David had unearthed. Covington Properties' stock plummeted by 40% overnight as investors panicked. The company's board of directors convened an emergency meeting and voted to oust her as CEO. Arthur Abernathy and his firm were hit with sanctions from the state bar for unethical conduct. His reputation as a legal shark was shattered. He was now seen as a reckless bully who had been outsmarted by a child. The story exploded into a national phenomenon. The video of David's cross-examination went viral, but this time it was a symbol of triumph. Law schools from Harvard to Stanford sent letters, not just of praise, but of provisional preemptive scholarship offers for the year 2034. Legal scholars debated the Miller precedent and its implications for pro-se assistants. For Sarah and David, life began to return to a new, brighter normal. They moved to a nicer apartment in a quieter neighborhood with some of the crowd-funded money. The rest, they decided, would be the seed money for something new. A week after the verdict, Sarah found David in his room. Not with his law books, but with a drawing pad. He was sketching a logo, a set of scales, like the scales of justice, but one side was being held up by a small hand, helping to balance it against a much larger one. "What's that, honey?" Sarah asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. "It's for the foundation," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The Miller Justice Initiative, for kids who have to help their parents fight monsters." Sarah's heart swelled with a love so fierce it almost hurt. The legal system had tried to crush them. An entitled, powerful woman had tried to break them, but they had refused to break. They had fought back not with anger, but with intelligence, not with hate, but with the simple, unshakable power of the truth. David had not only protected his mom, he had exposed a rot that ran deep, and in doing so had started a process of healing that would extend far beyond their own lives. The verdict was in, but the real work was just beginning. The air outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse was different this time. The day the summons arrived, the building had seemed like a granite fortress of intimidation. Now, bathed in the warm afternoon sun, it felt like a place where justice, however improbable, was possible. Sarah and David walked down the front steps, not as defendants, but as victors. A crowd of reporters and well-wishers had gathered, their cameras flashing like a constellation of man-made stars. They didn't stop to answer the shouted questions. Their victory wasn't about fame, it was about peace. They walked past the media scrum, hand in hand, a quiet island of calm in a sea of noise. The changes spurred by their case began to ripple outwards, creating waves they could never have anticipated. In the North Carolina state legislature, a new bill was introduced. Dubbed the Miller Act, it sought to clarify and strengthen the rights of pro se litigants, formally allowing them to designate a non-attorney assistant, like a family member or trusted friend, to help with organizing documents and conducting research. The bill cited David's performance in court as a key example of how empowering citizens to navigate the legal system could lead to fairer outcomes. Judge Marcus Thompson became an unlikely champion for the cause. In a widely published op-ed for a national newspaper, he wrote about his own initial prejudice and how a 9-year-old boy had reminded him that the spirit of the law was more important than its rigid traditions. He began guest lecturing at local law schools, using Covington versus Miller as a case study in judicial humility and the importance of looking beyond the surface. The Miller Justice Initiative became a reality faster than they could have imagined. Bolstered by donations from around the country, it was established as a non-profit dedicated to providing resources for low-income families facing intimidating civil lawsuits. It didn't offer lawyers, but it offered knowledge. Workshops on filing court documents, classes on the rules of evidence, and a library of legal resources simplified for the layperson. It was built on David's core belief that the first step to balancing the scales of justice was understanding how they worked. David, for his part, tried his best to just be a kid. He played basketball with his friends, did his homework, and argued with his mom about bedtime. But something within him had irrevocably changed. He carried a quiet confidence now, a deep-seated understanding that even the most imposing systems could be challenged by a single, well-reasoned voice. The law was no longer just his father's legacy. It was his calling. One evening, months after the trial, Sarah was tucking him into bed. The whirlwind had finally settled, and their life had found a gentle, happy rhythm. "Are you proud of me, Mom?" David asked, his voice soft in the dim light of his bedroom. Sarah brushed the hair back from his forehead. Her eyes welled with tears. "Proud isn't a big enough word, David," she whispered. "You were brave when I was scared. You were strong when I was weak. You didn't just save me, You reminded me of who I am. He had been her shield. But in a way, she had been his too. Her love and her belief in him had been the foundation upon which he had built his incredible defense. They had saved each other. The final scene of their public drama wasn't one of courtroom battles or flashing cameras. It was this quiet moment of peace. A mother and son, their lives forever changed, finding solace in their shared resilience. They had faced down a giant and won. They had shown the world that courage has no age limit and that justice, though often hidden, is always worth fighting for. As David closed his eyes, he didn't dream of law books or courtrooms. He dreamed of a future where no child would ever have to stand on a step stool to be heard, a future he now knew he had the power to help build. The scales were still heavy on one side, but a small hand had shown just how much it could do to set them right. In the end, David and Sarah's story became a powerful testament to how courage, armed with knowledge, can dismantle injustice. They proved that the law should be a shield for everyone, not just a weapon for the powerful. Their journey from public humiliation to a landmark victory sparked a conversation across the nation, inspiring real change and reminding us all of the strength found in standing up for what is right, no matter how small you may feel or how powerful your opponent seems. Their fight was over, but their mission, to ensure everyone has a voice in the halls of justice, was just beginning. Thank you for watching this incredible story. If you were inspired by David's courage, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more content that matters.